The 12-year-old girl risked losing her job to help a stranger with Alzheimer's get home. What happened the next morning made her mother burst into tears. The stack of newspapers landed with a thud in Sarah Johnson's rusty wagon. She checked her watch, 3:45 p.m. The autumn sun was already starting its descent, painting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk of West Pine Street. Sarah adjusted her worn blue sweatshirt and gripped the wagon's handle, its familiar squeak a reminder of another afternoon of deliveries ahead. "Remember to collect from the Hendersons today," Mr. Patterson called from the distribution center's doorway. "They're 3 weeks behind." Sarah nodded, her dark curls bouncing slightly. "Yes, sir, I'll make sure to stop there first." The morning's conversation with her mother echoed in her head as she started down her route. The kitchen table had been covered with bills, her mother's fingers nervously tapping next to the overdue notices. "We'll figure something out, sweetie," her mother had said, forcing a smile. "We always do." Sarah had watched her mother's shoulders slump when she thought no one was looking. The weight of being a single parent showed in the dark circles under her eyes and the extra shifts she picked up at the diner. The first few deliveries went quickly. Sarah's routine was well practiced after 6 months on the job. Grab paper, fold, secure with rubber band, aim for the porch. The Hendersons' house loomed ahead, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn a stark contrast to the well-maintained homes around it. Sarah climbed the creaky steps and knocked. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her thin frame wrapped in a faded housecoat. "Oh, Sarah dear, is it that time already?" "Yes. Mr. Patterson asked me to collect for the past 3 weeks. Mrs. Henderson's face fell. "I'm still waiting on my Social Security check. Could you give me until Friday?" Sarah saw the same worry line she recognized from her mother's face. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson. I'll let Mr. Patterson know. You're an angel, just like your father was," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "He'd be proud of you, helping out your mama like this." Sarah's chest tightened at the mention of her father. The memories were more like photographs now, static images of a man she barely remembered. She managed a small smile and continued her route. The afternoon wore on. Sarah stopped to help Mrs. Chin bring in her groceries, earning a warm cookie for her trouble. Mr. Roberts waved from his rocking chair, asking about her grades as she delivered his paper. These small interactions were her favorite part of the job, even if they slowed her down. The sun had dipped lower when she reached Maple Avenue. Sarah checked her watch again, 5:30 p.m. She still had 12 deliveries to go. That's when she noticed him. An elderly man stood on the corner, wearing a beige sweater and khaki pants that looked expensive but wrinkled. He kept turning in circles, looking up and down the street with increasing distress. His white hair was disheveled, and his hands shook as he patted his pockets. Sarah paused. She was already running behind, and Mr. Patterson had warned her about missing delivery times. But something in the man's lost expression tugged at her. "Excuse me, sir," she called out. "Are you okay?" The man turned toward her, voice, relief flooding his face. "Oh, yes, hello. I'm just—" He looked around again, confusion clouding his features. "I'm trying to get home, but the streets look different today." Sarah glanced at her wagon full of undelivered papers, then back at the man. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Where do you live, sir? Maybe I can help you find it." He hesitated, brow furrowing. "It's the blue house. Or maybe green. Margaret will be waiting. She always waits." Sarah's stomach knotted. She thought of her mother's words that morning. "Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, baby." A man in a dark suit stood half a block away, watching them. Sarah felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. The elderly man needed help, and she couldn't just leave him here. "I'm Sarah," she said, moving closer. "What's your name?" "Robert." "Robert Williams," he replied, then added with a hint of uncertainty. "At least, I'm quite sure that's right." Sarah noticed his expensive watch and well-made shoes. This wasn't someone who belonged on this side of town. She took another look at her watch, did some quick math, and made her decision. "Mr. Williams, would you like me to walk with you? We can look for your house together." The relief in his eyes was immediate. "Oh, would you? That's very kind indeed." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the trembling. Sarah pulled her wagon closer to the curb and took out her phone. "Mom? Yeah, I'm going to be late today. There's something I need to do." She paused, listening. "I know, but it's important. I'll explain later." She ended the call and turned to Mr. Williams. Okay, so let's find your home. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Sarah knew she'd probably lose her job over this. But as Mr. Williams gripped her hand like a lifeline, she couldn't bring herself to care. Some things were more important than delivering papers on time. Tell me about your house. Mr. Williams, what does it look like? As they started walking, Sarah noticed the man in the suit begin to follow at a distance. She gripped Mr. Williams' hand tighter and thought of her father. Would he have done the same thing? The answer came easily. Of course he would have. The remaining papers sat in her wagon, waiting. But right now, Sarah had more pressing deliveries to make, getting a lost soul back home. The street lamps flickered to life as Sarah and Mr. Williams made their way down Cedar Street. His grip on her hand remained steady, but his eyes darted around like a trapped animal's. The man in the dark suit maintained his distance, always staying about half a block behind them. Mr. Williams, do you remember what you were doing before you got lost? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. He stopped walking and rubbed his forehead. I take walks. Every day at 4. Margaret says it's good for my health. His voice cracked slightly. But today the streets changed. They moved them all around. Sarah noticed his breathing getting faster. The streets didn't move, so sometimes things just look different when we're tired. Here, let's sit for a minute. They found a bench in front of Mike's hardware store. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Probably her mother, but she ignored it. Mr. Williams sat down heavily, his expensive pants getting dusty from the old wooden bench. I should know this, he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. I've lived here for. His hands started shaking again. It's okay, Sarah said quickly. Tell me about Margaret instead. His face brightened immediately. Margaret. My Margaret. We met in college, you know. She wore a yellow dress the first time I saw her. He smiled, and for a moment, his eyes cleared. She still has that dress. Won't throw it away, even though it's all faded now. Sarah watched the man in the suit move closer, then stop near a coffee shop. He spoke quietly into what looked like a phone or radio. She felt her nerves tingle but focused on Mr. Williams. That's a nice memory, she said. Does Margaret like to garden? I notice lots of people around here have beautiful gardens. Mr. Williams leaned forward suddenly. Roses. Margaret grows roses. Red ones, by the front gate. He stood up so quickly that Sarah had to grab his arm to steady him. We have a white gate, with roses. Red roses. Sarah felt a spark of hope. That's great. Let's walk a little more and look for houses with red roses. They continued down the street, Mr. Williams shuffling along beside her. The temperature was dropping, and Sarah wished she'd worn a warmer sweatshirt. Her wagon of undelivered papers sat abandoned blocks behind them. Young lady, Mr. Williams said suddenly, his voice clearer than before. You're missing school, aren't you? To help me? No, sir, it's after school. I was just doing my paper route. He stopped walking and looked at her with surprising sharpness. Paper route? But you left it. Because of me. His face crumpled. Oh dear. I'm causing trouble. Sarah squeezed his hand. It's okay, Mr. Williams, really. I choose to help you. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about her father, about the stories her mother told of how he'd always stop to help others, even when they couldn't afford to give anything back. Because it's right, she said simply. And because sometimes people get lost, and they need someone to help them find their way back. Mr. Williams' eyes filled with tears. I get lost a lot now. In my mind, Margaret says it's the Alzheimer's, but I don't remember getting it. He laughed weakly at his own joke. They turned onto Oakwood Drive, and Mr. Williams stopped again. Wait, this corner. That tree. He pointed to a massive oak. I know that tree. Sarah felt her heart speed up. You do? Do you walk past it on your daily walks? Yes, I turn here. By the big oak. His excitement faded slightly. Or, do I? Sometimes I remember things that aren't real anymore. The man in the suit was talking into his radio again, moving closer. Sarah could see he wore an earpiece. Under the streetlight, she noticed he looked worried rather than threatening. Let's try this way, Sarah suggested, guiding Mr. Williams down Oakwood Drive. Tell me more about your house. What color did you say it was? Blue. No, green. He pressed his hands against his temples. Why can't I remember? I live there. It's all right, Sarah said quickly, noticing his distress. Look for the red roses instead. Those you remember clearly. They walked another block. Sarah's feet were starting to hurt, and she knew her mother must be frantic by now. The street was lined with older homes, each unique and well-maintained. Mr. Williams looked at each one carefully, but none sparked recognition. Then they turned onto Hillcrest Avenue, and Mr. Williams stopped so abruptly that Sarah nearly stumbled. The lamppost, he whispered. The crooked one. Margaret always says we should call the city about it. His eyes moved to the house behind it. The roses. Sarah, the roses. There they were, red roses climbing a white gate, just as he'd described. The house behind them was painted a soft sage green. On the porch, an elderly woman in a cardigan paced back and forth, phone pressed to her ear. Margaret, Mr. Williams called out, his voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. The woman on the porch spun around. Robert? Robert! She rushed down the steps with surprising speed. Sarah felt Mr. Williams' hand slip from hers as he moved toward his wife. Behind them, the man in the suit was speaking rapidly into his radio, relief visible on his face. Margaret reached them, pulling Mr. Williams into a tight embrace. Where have you been? I've been so worried. You were gone so long this time. I got lost, he said simply. But this young lady, this. He turned back to Sarah, confusion crossing his face again. I'm sorry, dear. I've forgotten your name. It's Sarah. Sir, Sarah, he repeated firmly. Sarah found me. Or I found her. I'm not quite sure anymore. Margaret looked at Sarah, really looked at her, taking in the worn sweatshirt and scuffed sneakers. You brought him home? Yes. I found him on Maple Avenue, looking lost. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. We've been searching for hours. The security team, the police. She glanced at the man in the suit, who had moved closer. Thank God you found him. Sarah shuffled her feet, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. I should go. My mom will be worried. Wait, Margaret called as Sarah turned to leave. Please wait. We need to thank you properly. But Sarah was already walking away, her mind on her abandoned paper route and her worried mother. Behind her, she heard Mr. Williams ask Margaret, Did I take my walk today? The sun had fully set now, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself and started the long walk back to her wagon, wondering if any of her customers would understand why their papers never arrived. She thought about Mr. Williams and Margaret, about the love in their voices when they spoke about each other. Even when his mind got cloudy, that love had shone through clearly. Like a compass pointing north, it had helped guide him home. Her phone buzzed again. This time, Sarah answered it. Mom. Sorry. I'm okay. I'll explain everything when I get home. You see, there was this lost man. Sarah's legs ached as she trudged back toward her abandoned wagon. The street lights cast yellow pools on the sidewalk, and the evening air had turned properly cold. Her phone showed 7 missed calls from her mother and 1 from Mr. Patterson. A car slowed beside her, and Sarah's heart jumped. The man in the suit from earlier rolled down his window. Miss, would you like a ride back to your wagon? It's quite a walk from here. Sarah stopped, keeping her distance from the car. My mom told me never to get in cars with strangers. The man nodded approvingly. Smart girl. I'm James Williams, Robert's son. I've been following you both all afternoon, making sure you were safe. He pulled out a business card and held it out. You can verify who I am. Sarah took the card cautiously. In the streetlight, she could read. James Williams, CEO, Williams Investment Group. I can call your mother from my phone if you'd like, James offered. Let her know you're safe and why you're running late. Sarah thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but I'll stand here while you call her. James smiled and dialed the number Sarah gave him. She could hear her mother's worried voice through the speaker. Mrs. Johnson, this is James Williams. Your daughter Sarah is with me. She spent the last few hours helping my father, who has Alzheimer's, find his way home. Yes, she's perfectly safe. In fact, she's shown remarkable kindness and maturity. Would you permit me to drive her back to her wagon and then home? I understand your concern. You're welcome to stay on the phone with her during the drive. After some discussion, Sarah's mother agreed. Sarah climbed into the back seat of the luxury car, keeping her phone on and connected to her mother the entire time. My father used to be one of the sharpest business minds in the city, James said as they drove. The Alzheimer started 3 years ago. Some days are better than others, but lately, he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Today was scary. He's never been lost this long before. They reached her wagon, still sitting where she'd left it hours ago. The newspapers inside were useless now. I'll lose my job, Sarah said quietly, looking at the undelivered papers. No, you won't, James replied firmly. I'll speak with your supervisor. In fact, I'd like to do much more than that. But first, let's get you home. Sarah's mother was waiting on their apartment building's front steps. She ran to the car before Sarah could even get out, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. Don't you ever disappear like that again, she scolded, but her voice was more relieved than angry. I was so worried. I'm sorry, Mom. But Mr. Williams needed help. James stepped out of the car. Mrs. Johnson, your daughter did something extraordinary today. Not many people would stop to help a confused elderly man, especially at the cost of their own job. Sarah's mother straightened up. Sarah's father was the same way, always helping others, even when we couldn't afford to. He sounds like a remarkable man, James said. Would you both join my family for dinner tomorrow? My mother insists on thanking Sarah properly. Sarah's mother hesitated. That's very kind, but we couldn't impose. Please, James said. It would mean a lot to my father. On his lucid days, he remembers acts of kindness. And my mother, well, she's been crying happy tears since Sarah brought him home. After some discussion, they agreed to dinner the next evening. James gave them his card with his address written on the back and bid them good night. Inside their small apartment, Sarah's mother made hot chocolate, their special occasion drink. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had been covered with bills that morning. I should ground you for scaring me like that, her mother said, but she was smiling. But I'm proud of you, baby. Your father would be too. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Do you think Mr. Williams will remember me tomorrow? Maybe not. But that's not why you helped him, is it? No. Sarah thought about how lost and scared he'd looked. I just couldn't leave him there. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's what makes you special, baby. You see people when they need to be seen. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Patterson, called by Mr. Williams' son. Take tomorrow off with pay. We'll talk Monday. Relief flooded through her. At least she hadn't lost her job. Later that night, lying in bed, Sarah thought about Mr. Williams and his wife. About James in his expensive car and suit. About her mother working double shifts to keep them afloat. The world was full of different kinds of people, she realized. But being lost could happen to anyone. Her last thought before drifting off to sleep was of Mr. Williams' face when he recognized his house. The way confusion had lifted for that brief moment, replaced by absolute certainty. Sometimes home was like that, a lighthouse in the fog, guiding you back where you belonged. The next morning dawned bright and cool. Sarah helped her mother pick out clothes for dinner at the Williams house. They didn't have much that seemed fancy enough, but her mother insisted that clean and neat was all that mattered. They invited us because of who you are, she said, ironing Sarah's best jeans. Not because of what you wear. Sarah nodded, but her stomach still churned with nerves. She'd seen the size of the Williams house, the expensive car James drove. Their world was so different from her own. The morning paper arrived, delivered by someone else on her route. Sarah watched through the window as neighbors picked up their papers, going about their normal Sunday routines. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday morning, but somehow everything felt different. Her mother came up behind her and wrapped her in a hug. You know what your father used to say? Kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything. Yesterday you proved how right he was. Sarah leaned back into her mother's embrace, watching the Sunday morning unfold outside their window. In a few hours, they would head to the Williams house, stepping into a world very different from their own. But right now, in this moment, Sarah felt rich in all the ways that really mattered. Monday morning arrived with a knot in Sarah's stomach. The weekend had felt like a dream. Dinner at the Williams mansion. Mrs. Williams hugging her tight. Mr. Williams having a clear moment where he called her my guardian angel. But now reality crashed back in as she stood outside Mr. Patterson's office at the newspaper distribution center. Come in, Sarah, Mr. Patterson called through the door. She stepped inside, hands clasped in front of her. The office smelled like coffee and old newspapers. Mr. Patterson sat behind his desk, looking more serious than usual. Sit down. He gestured to the chair across from him. We need to talk about Saturday. I know I messed up, Mr. Patterson. I left my route unfinished. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. 12 families didn't get their papers. The Hendersons still haven't paid. And you abandoned your wagon on a public street. Yes, sir. Under normal circumstances, that would be immediate termination. Sarah's throat tightened. Despite James Williams' call, despite everything, she was still going to lose her job. Mr. Patterson's stern expression suddenly broke into a smile. But these weren't normal circumstances, were they? Sir, do you know who Robert Williams is, Sarah? Who his family is? Sarah shook her head. The Williams family owns half the businesses in this city, including this newspaper distribution center. James Williams didn't just call me. He called my boss, and his boss. Mr. Patterson chuckled. Do you know what he said? No, sir. He said his father hasn't had a clear moment like he did at dinner last night in months. Said seeing you again triggered something, a connection. Memory's funny that way. He pulled out a paper from his desk. They've paid all the Hendersons' outstanding bills, by the way, and set up a fund to cover papers for elderly residents who can't afford them. Sarah sat there, stunned. You're not fired, Sarah. In fact, you're getting a raise. And your route is being cut in half. James Williams insists you need more time for studying. But the other families on my route will be taken care of, Mr. Patterson assured her. Sometimes doing the right thing works out better than doing the expected thing. Sarah left the office in a daze. She had expected consequences, punishment even. Instead, she got a raise and a shorter route. Her phone buzzed as she walked home. A text from an unknown number. Sarah, it's Margaret Williams. Robert's having a good day and asked about you. Would you like to come for tea? Before Sarah could respond, another message came through. James can send a car. She called her mother at the diner. Mom? Mrs. Williams invited me for tea. Is it okay if I go? Of course, baby. Just keep me updated. Okay. 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment. The driver, a kind-faced man named Thomas, opened the door for her. Miss Sarah, he said with a warm smile. The Williams family has told me all about you. The drive to the Williams estate felt shorter this time. Sarah watched the neighborhoods change, houses getting bigger, lawns more manicured. They passed through the iron gate she remembered from Saturday night, the ones flanked by Mrs. Williams' red roses. Margaret Williams met her at the door, pulling her into a warm hug that smelled like vanilla and tea. Thank you for coming, dear. Robert's in the sunroom. The house looked different in daylight. Sarah noticed details she'd missed during dinner. Family photos spanning decades, art on the walls that probably cost more than her mom made in a year, fresh flowers in every room. Mr. Williams sat in a plush chair by a window, sunlight highlighting his white hair. His eyes were clearer today, more focused. Sarah, he smiled broadly. I remembered your name all by myself today. That's wonderful, Mr. Williams. Please, call me Robert. You've earned that right. He patted the chair next to him. Tell me about school. Do you enjoy your studies? They talked for an hour, about Sarah's classes, her favorite subjects, math and literature, her dreams of maybe becoming a doctor someday. Robert listened intently, asking sharp questions that showed his mind was having one of its better days. Margaret brought tea and cookies, settling into her own chair. Sarah, James wanted to be here, but he had a board meeting. He asked me to discuss something with you and your mother. Is everything okay? More than okay. Margaret set her teacup down. We'd like to establish an educational trust for you. For private school now, and college later. Sarah nearly choked on her cookie. Private school? But that's too much. Nothing is too much, Robert cut in firmly. You helped me find my way home. Now let us help you find your way forward. I didn't help you for money, Sarah protested. Of course you didn't, Margaret said softly. That's exactly why we want to do this. James is setting up the paperwork. All your mother needs to do is sign. Sarah's head spun. Private school? College? These were dreams she'd barely let herself think about, knowing how hard it was for her mother to just keep them afloat. We're not trying to change your life, Margaret continued, seeing Sarah's overwhelmed expression. We're trying to expand it. Give you more options, more opportunities. I don't know what to say. Robert reached over and patted her hand. Say yes. Let an old man do something good with his money while he still remembers he has it. A knock at the door interrupted them. James Williams stepped in, his suit as immaculate as ever. Sorry I'm late. Board meeting ran over. He loosened his tie and sat down. I see Mother's told you about our proposal. Sarah nodded, still stunned. I've researched the best private schools in the area. There's one just 15 minutes from your apartment, Brighton Academy. They'd be happy to have you start next semester. But what about my paper route? My regular school? My friends? James smiled. The paper route stays if you want it, just the shorter version. As for friends, he glanced at his father. Real friends stay with you no matter where you go to school. Just like real kindness stays with you even when your memories fade. Robert nodded, though his eyes had started to get that slight confused look again. Sarah helped me, he said, more to himself than the others. She helped me find home. Margaret squeezed her husband's hand. Yes, dear, she did. We'd like to help you build your future, Sarah, James said. No strings attached. If Brighton doesn't work out, we'll find another solution. If you decide you don't want to go to college, the money will be there for whatever education or training you choose. Sarah looked around the sunroom, at Robert starting to drift into his own thoughts, at Margaret watching him with loving concern, at James in his expensive suit trying to change her life. She thought about her mother, about all her sacrifices. Can I think about it? Talk to my mom. Of course, James stood up. In fact, why don't I drive you home now? We can discuss it with your mother together. As they got up to leave, Robert suddenly grabbed Sarah's hand. You're the girl, he said urgently. The girl who brought me home. Yes, Mr. Williams, that was me. Good. He nodded. Don't get lost, Sarah. Stay found. In the car with James, Sarah watched the neighborhoods change again. Mansions giving way to ordinary houses, then to her familiar apartment buildings. He might not remember tomorrow, James said quietly. But today he knows you. That's a gift you gave us. A clear day, a connection. Let us give something back. Sarah looked out the window at her changing world. I just did what anyone would do. James laughed. No, Sarah. You did what very few people would do. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. No questions asked, no reward expected. That's rare. That's special. That's worth investing in. Sarah's mother dropped her fork, and it clattered against the kitchen table. $10 million. James Williams sat across from them in their small kitchen, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. The evening light filtering through their worn curtains made the papers he'd laid out glow golden. The Educational Trust is set up to cover all expenses through college and graduate school, if Sarah chooses that path, he explained. The remaining funds will be available when she turns 25. Sarah watched her mother's hand shake as she picked up her fork again. This is too much. We can't accept this. Mrs. Johnson. James leaned forward, his voice gentle. My father's condition is progressing faster than we'd like. Some days, he doesn't recognize his own reflection. But he recognizes Sarah. When he sees her, something clicks into place. But 10 million dash is nothing compared to what your daughter gave us. James pulled out another document. We'd also like to set up a separate fund for you, Mrs. Johnson, to ensure you never have to work double shifts again. Sarah's mother started crying. Not the quiet tears Sarah was used to seeing when bills piled up, but deep, body-shaking sobs. Mom! Sarah moved to hug her mother. We don't have to accept it if you don't want to. Baby, her mother pulled back, cupping Sarah's face in her hands. All I've ever wanted was to give you opportunities. And now, she turned to James. Why? Why so much? Because money should serve a purpose, James said. My father built his company from nothing. He always said wealth was meaningless unless it made the world better. Sarah showed pure kindness to a stranger. That's the kind of person we want to invest in. A knock at their door interrupted them. Margaret Williams stood there, holding a casserole dish. I hope you don't mind, she said, stepping in. I thought we could all have dinner together while we talk. Sarah helped Margaret set up dinner, watching as their cheap plates were loaded with what smelled like the most expensive lasagna she'd ever encountered. Robert wanted to come, Margaret said, serving portions that made Sarah's eyes widen. But he was having a difficult evening. He kept asking when the girl with the wagon was coming back. How often does he have clear days? Sarah's mother asked softly. Less and less. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. But since meeting Sarah, it's like she's become an anchor point in his mind. Something he can hold on to. They ate dinner together. The wealthy Williams couple and the Johnsons in their tiny kitchen. Sarah watched her mother slowly relax as Margaret shared stories about Robert's earlier years, about raising James, about the challenges and joys of their life. Brighton Academy's uniform shop is open tomorrow, James mentioned casually. If you'd like, we could dash. I haven't said yes yet, Sarah interrupted. The adults fell silent. What's holding you back, sweetie? Her mother asked. Sarah pushed her lasagna around her plate. What if I don't fit in? What if I'm not smart enough? What if everyone there looks down on me because I'm not rich? James finished. Sarah, do you know what my father was at your age? A paper bow. Just like you. Sarah looked up in surprise. It's true. Margaret nodded. He delivered papers and worked at a grocery store after school. Put himself through college. Built everything from nothing. But that's different, Dash. No, James said firmly. It's not. Success isn't about where you start. It's about recognizing opportunities and having the courage to take them. Sarah's mother reached for her hand. Baby, your father and I always dreamed of giving you every chance in the world. Maybe this is him, still looking out for you. Fresh tears spilled down her mother's cheeks, but she was smiling now. Okay, Sarah whispered. Then louder. Okay. Yes. I'll go to Brighton. Margaret clapped her hands together. Wonderful. Now, about the uniform shopping dash. I can't skip work tomorrow, Sarah's mother started, but James cut her off. Mrs. Johnson, part of the agreement we're proposing includes a new position for you. Senior Community Outreach Coordinator for the Williams Foundation. Full benefits, flexible schedule. What? Sarah's mother stared at him. We're establishing a foundation to help elderly residents in the community, starting with those on Sarah's paper route. We need someone who understands the neighborhood, who has compassion and experience with service work. He smiled. Sound like anyone you know? Sarah watched her mother's face transform as she realized what this meant. No more double shifts. No more choosing between bills. No more wearing herself to exhaustion. When can I start? Her mother asked, voice thick with emotion. How about next week? Take a few days to shop with Sarah. Help her prepare for Brighton. James pulled out his phone. I'll have Thomas bring the car around tomorrow morning at 9. Later that night, after the Williams had left with promises to pick them up the next day, Sarah lay in bed listening to her mother move around their apartment. She heard quiet sobs from the living room and got up to investigate. Her mother sat on their worn couch, holding an old photo of Sarah's father. Mom, are you okay? Come here, baby. Her mother patted the couch beside her. I was just telling your daddy about our miracle. Sarah curled up next to her mother, looking at the photo. Her father's smile was bright and kind, just like in all her hazy memories. He would be so proud of you, her mother whispered. Not because of the money or the school, but because you have his heart. You see people, baby. You see them and you help them, no matter what it costs you. I was scared, Sarah admitted, when I saw Mr. Williams looking lost. But I kept thinking about what you and Dad always said about doing the right thing. Her mother hugged her tight. Sometimes the biggest blessings come from the smallest acts of kindness. Your father believed that. Looks like he was right. They sat together on the couch, holding the photo, imagining how different their lives would be now. But Sarah realized something important hadn't changed at all. The love in their tiny apartment, the memories of her father, the values her parents had taught her. Mom, Sarah asked sleepily, will you tell me the story about how you and Dad met? Her mother launched into the familiar tale, and Sarah closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, uniform shopping, school preparations, a whole new life opening up before them. But tonight was for remembering where they came from and who they were at heart. No amount of money could change that. The Brighton Academy uniform felt stiff against Sarah's skin. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blazer with trembling fingers. The school's crest gleamed on her chest, gold thread catching the morning light. You look beautiful, baby, her mother said from the doorway. She wore a new suit of her own. Her first day as community outreach coordinator started today, too. A gentle honk from outside signaled Thomas's arrival. Over the past week, the Williams driver had become a familiar presence in their lives, shuttling them to uniform fittings, school orientation, and daily visits with Robert and Margaret. Ready? Her mother asked. Sarah grabbed her new leather backpack, a gift from James. Ready? The drive to Brighton Academy felt like entering another world. Stone buildings rose behind wrought iron gates, and students in matching uniforms streamed across manicured lawns. Thomas pulled up to the drop-off area. "Good luck, Miss Sarah," he said warmly. "Mrs. Williams asked me to remind you about dinner tonight." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. She stepped out of the car, clutching her backpack like a shield. "Sarah," a voice called out. James Williams stood near the administration building, wearing one of his impeccable suits. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to be here for your first day." Relief flooded through her. "You didn't have to dash. I wanted to." He smiled. "Besides, I'm on the school board. It's perfectly normal for me to be here." Sarah's mother hugged her tight. "You've got this, baby. I'll see you tonight at the Williams. The morning passed in a blur of new faces and information. Sarah's teachers had clearly been briefed about her situation. They were almost too welcoming, too encouraging. Her classmates watched her with curious eyes, whispering behind their hands. During lunch, she sat alone at the edge of the cafeteria, picking at food that looked more like restaurant fare than school lunch. A girl with copper-colored hair approached her table. "You're Sarah Johnson, right?" "I'm Emma Chen." She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "My dad's company works with Williams Investment Group. Is it true you're Mr. Williams' granddaughter?" "What?" "No, Emma." James's voice cut through the conversation. He stood behind them, holding a paper bag. "I believe your father mentioned you'd make Sarah feel welcome, not interrogate her." Emma blushed. "Sorry, Mr. Williams, sorry, Sarah." James sat down with them. "I brought you something." He pulled a chocolate chip cookie from the bag. "Margaret stress bakes when she's worried. She made these for you this morning." Sarah took the cookie, warmth spreading through her chest. "She was worried about me. We all were." "Ow!" He looked around the cafeteria. "It's a big change. Everyone keeps staring at me." "They're curious," James said. "It's not every day a new student starts mid-semester with a Williams endorsement. But they'll get used to you." He turned to Emma. "Right?" Emma nodded eagerly. "Totally. Want to sit with me and my friends tomorrow? We're not all trust fund babies, I promise." The afternoon classes went smoother. Emma introduced her to other students, and the whispers died down. By final bell, Sarah had 3 phone numbers and an invitation to a study group. Thomas was waiting outside. "To the Williams house?" he asked as she climbed in. "Yes, please." Sarah sank into the leather seat, exhausted but relieved. Her mother was already there when she arrived, deep in conversation with Margaret about community programs. Robert sat in his usual chair by the window, but his eyes were distant today. "Sarah." Margaret hurried over to hug her. "How was your first day? Did you eat the cookies? Should I make more?" "It was good," Sarah assured her. "Different, but good." "Come say hello to Robert," Margaret said softly. "He's having a harder day, but he might recognize you." Sarah approached the elderly man carefully. "Hello, Mr. Williams." He turned toward her, voice, confusion clouding his features. Then, slowly, his eyes cleared slightly. The girl with the wagon." "Yes, sir, it's Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated. "You helped me find home." "That's right." He reached for her hand, his grip frailer than she remembered. "Stay for dinner?" "Of course." The Williams chef had prepared a feast, but the meal felt comfortably familiar now. Sarah told them about her day while her mother shared ideas for the foundation. James discussed Brighton Academy's curriculum, and Margaret kept trying to serve everyone second helpings. "I have something to show you," Robert said suddenly, his voice stronger. He stood up, waving away Margaret's helping hand. "In my study." They all followed him down the hall to a wood-paneled room lined with books. Robert went straight to his desk and opened a drawer. "Here," he said, pulling out an old photograph. "Look." The photo showed a young boy in worn clothes, holding a stack of newspapers. Sarah gasped. "Is that you?" "My first job," Robert said proudly. "Delivering papers. Just like you." He squinted at the photo. "Oh, was it me?" "Margaret?" "Yes, dear." Margaret touched his arm gently. "That's you at 12 years old?" 12. He looked at Sarah. "How old are you?" 12, sir." "Good age," he nodded. "Good age for delivering papers. For helping people find their way home." His voice trailed off, and the confusion returned to his eyes. I think it's time for your medicine, dear, Margaret said softly. As she led Robert out, James turned to Sarah. He kept that photo on his desk his whole career. Used to tell me it reminded him where he came from, kept him humble. Will he remember this tomorrow? Sarah asked. Maybe not the details. But he remembers you, in his way. The girl with the wagon who helped him. That story sticks, even on his bad days. Sarah's mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Just like your father's stories stick with us. They finished the evening in the family room, where James and Sarah's mother discussed foundation business while Margaret taught Sarah how to play chess. Robert dozed in his chair nearby, occasionally mumbling about newspapers and wagons. As Thomas drove them home later, Sarah thought about the photograph of young Robert Williams delivering papers. About how life could change so dramatically, taking you from a paper route to a mansion, or from a tiny apartment to Brighton Academy. Did you ever imagine this would be our life? She asked her mother. No, baby. Her mother smiled. But your father always said life's biggest blessings come in unexpected packages. Sarah touched her Brighton blazer, thinking of Emma's friendship offer, Margaret's cookies, Robert's old photo. Maybe the biggest change wasn't the money or the new school. Maybe it was finding a second family, one built not on blood but on a simple act of kindness. She thought about tomorrow, another day at Brighton, another dinner with the Williams, another chance to see Robert's eyes clear with recognition, even if just for a moment. Mom! I think we're going to be okay. Her mother squeezed her hand. Baby, we were always okay. Now we're just okay with a few more people in our corner. The city lights blurred past their car window, and Sarah felt the stiffness of her new uniform softening, molding to her shape. Like everything else in her new life, it just needed time to feel like it belonged. 1 month into her time at Brighton Academy, Sarah still reached for her paper wagon some mornings before remembering her new reality. The morning sun streamed through the window of their new apartment, a spacious 3-bedroom in a secure building, courtesy of the Williams Foundation's housing program. Breakfast, her mother called from their actual dining room. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. Sarah adjusted her Brighton tie in the mirror. The uniform no longer felt stiff. She'd worn it in, like breaking in new shoes. Emma had shown her how to add subtle personal touches within the school's strict dress code. A delicate bracelet, small stud earrings, her father's old watch that her mother had saved. You're going to be late, her mother warned as Sarah finally emerged. Thomas is already waiting. Sorry, I was finishing my calculus homework. Sarah grabbed a piece of bacon. We're stopping by to see Mr. Williams before school. Mrs. Williams said he had a good morning. Her mother nodded, smoothing her own business attire. The foundation job had transformed her, not just financially, but in confidence. She stood straighter now, spoke more assertively. Tell them I'll be there this afternoon for the board meeting, her mother said. We're reviewing applications for the Elderly Assistance Program. Thomas waited in the car, as punctual as ever. Good morning, Miss Sarah. Mrs. Williams called ahead. Mr. Williams is quite lucid today. The drive to the Williams estate had become part of Sarah's morning routine. 3 days a week, she stopped by before school. Sometimes Robert barely recognized her. Other days, like today, his mind was clearer. Sarah, he called out as she entered the sunroom. Come look at this. He sat at his usual spot by the window, but today he had newspapers spread across the table in front of him. Margaret hovered nearby, joy and worry mingling on her face. He woke up asking for his old papers, Margaret explained quietly. James brought them from storage. He's been reading them all morning. Robert pointed to a yellowed page. Look here, my first advertisement. Williams Investment Group, 1975. Just 2 employees then, me and my secretary. He looked up at Sarah. You remind me of myself back then. Young, but determined. Sarah sat beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile papers. Will you tell me about it? Oh, yes. You see, I started with nothing but a paper route. He launched into the story, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Margaret discreetly wiped tears from her eyes. Sarah needs to get to school, dear, Margaret said gently when Robert paused for breath. School? Yes, Brighton Academy. He focused on Sarah's uniform. Good school. Work hard there. I am. Sir, I have a math test today. Math. He nodded. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Markets lie. But numbers, Numbers always tell the truth. His eyes started to drift. What was I saying? You were telling me about starting your company, Sarah said softly. Was I? Yes, perhaps I was. The clarity began fading from his eyes. Don't forget your papers. Can't be late for deliveries. Sarah squeezed his hand before leaving. In the hall, Margaret hugged her tight. Thank you, the older woman whispered. These moments, they are precious. At Brighton, Sarah slid into her usual seat next to Emma in homeroom. Her friend was already reviewing calculus notes. Ready for the test? Emma asked. I think so. Your study group really helped. Speaking of which, Emma lowered her voice. Is it true about the foundation? My dad said your mom's running it now. Sarah nodded. Co-running, with James. They're helping elderly residents in my old neighborhood. That's so cool. Emma paused. Some kids are saying weird stuff, though. About you and the Williams family. What kind of stuff? That you, manipulated them or something. But they are just jealous. Emma rolled her eyes. I told them about Mr. Williams having Alzheimer's, how you helped him. Shut them up pretty quick. The calculus test was easier than Sarah expected. Mr. Williams' voice echoed in her head. Numbers don't lie. She finished early and thought about how much had changed in just a month. Her old paper route had been taken over by twins from her former neighborhood. She still visited her old customers sometimes, now bringing groceries and assistance applications instead of newspapers. Mrs. Henderson had been the first recipient of the Foundation's housing repairs program. After school, Thomas drove her to the Foundation office where her mother worked. The sleek building downtown felt like another world compared to the diner where her mother used to waitress. Baby, her mother waved from a conference room. Come here. I want you to see something. Inside, James and several board members sat around a table covered in documents. A familiar face lit up when Sarah entered. Mrs. Henderson. Her former customer smiled broadly. Sarah, dear, I'm telling them about the neighborhood, helping identify who needs help most. Mrs. Henderson is our community liaison, James explained. Who better to help us understand local needs than someone who's lived there 40 years? Sarah watched as her mother led the meeting, confident and passionate. They discussed home repairs, medical assistance, transportation services, all the things Sarah used to see her elderly customers struggle with. We're expanding, James told her during a break. Your mother's idea, setting up similar programs in other neighborhoods. Really? She understands what communities need. Like father, like daughter, you both see people others might miss. That evening, they had dinner at the Williams house, as usual. Robert was having a harder time, the morning's clarity long gone. But he smiled when Sarah sat next to him. The girl, he said softly. The girl who helps people get home. That's right, Mr. Williams. Good girl. Good heart. He patted her hand. Like me with my papers. Margaret served dinner, comfort food tonight, pot roast and potatoes. The conversation flowed easily between Foundation business and school updates. Sarah noticed how naturally her mother fit into this world now, discussing budgets and programs with James while Margaret shared family stories. Oh! Margaret suddenly remembered something. Sarah, Robert's doctor said your visits are making a difference. The regular interaction, the connection to his past through your paper route, it's helping slow the progression. Really? Memory's strange that way, James said. Some things stick. You've become one of those things for him. Sarah looked at Robert, who was carefully cutting his pot roast. Do you think he knows how much has changed my life? Oh, honey. Margaret reached across the table to squeeze her hand. You changed ours first. Later that night, in their new apartment, Sarah found her mother looking at old photos again. Dad would love this, Sarah said, sitting beside her. Helping people, making a difference. He'd love you, her mother corrected. How you've handled everything. The money, the new school, staying true to yourself through all of it. Sarah picked up a photo of her father in his delivery uniform. He'd worked as a package courier, another person who helped things find their way home. I miss him, she said simply. I know, baby. But I think he led you to the Williams family. His spirit of helping others, his kindness. That's what made you stop that day to help Robert. Sarah thought about Robert's lucid morning, about Mrs. Henderson helping the Foundation, about Emma defending her at school, about how much could change in a month, yet how the important things, kindness, family, helping others, stayed the same. Mom, I'm glad I kept Dad's watch. It helps me remember who I am, even in my fancy uniform. Her mother hugged her close. Baby, your father used to say the finest clothes in the world couldn't make a person fine. Only their actions could do that. Sarah touched the old watch on her wrist, then looked around their new apartment. Everything had changed, yet nothing truly important had changed at all. She was still her father's daughter, still her mother's child, still the girl who couldn't walk past someone in need. The money was nice, the opportunities incredible, but the real wealth was in the connections, the families bridged, the lives touched, the homes found. Different kinds of paper routes, her father would have said, different ways of helping people find their way home. The assignment had seemed simple enough when Ms. Parker announced it in Social Studies. Present a personal story about family legacy and community impact. But now, standing in front of a Brighton Academy classmates, Sarah felt her heart racing. My story begins with a paper route, she started, her voice shaky. She glanced at Emma in the front row, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up. But it's not really about delivering newspapers. It's about delivering something more important. Hope, kindness, and finding your way home. The classroom fell silent. Even Jason Turner, who usually texted under his desk, looked up with interest. 2 months ago, I was a regular kid with a paper route, helping my mom make ends meet. Then one afternoon, I saw an elderly man looking lost on my route. He was well-dressed but confused, turning in circles on the sidewalk. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering that day vividly. That man was Robert Williams, yes, that Williams, she acknowledged as whispers broke out. But I didn't know who he was then. I just saw someone who needed help. She described the long walk through the neighborhood, Robert's confusion, and the final moment of recognition when they found his house. As she spoke, she noticed Ms. Parker wiping her eyes discreetly. Mr. Williams has Alzheimer's, Sarah continued. Some days he remembers me, some days he doesn't. But his family says our connection helps him hold on to pieces of himself. And in return, they've helped my mom and me build a new life. The door opened quietly, and Sarah's voice caught in her throat. James Williams stood there, alongside her mother and Margaret. They'd come to watch her presentation, just as they'd promised. But this story isn't about money or opportunity, Sarah said, standing straighter. It's about what my father always taught me before he passed away, that kindness costs nothing but means everything. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of the Williams Foundation's first community event. Her mother stood with Mrs. Henderson, handing out assistance applications to elderly residents. Today, my mom helps run the Williams Foundation, making sure other elderly people in our community get the help they need. Mrs. Henderson, one of my old paper route customers, helps identify who needs assistance most. It's like a chain reaction of kindness. Another slide showed Robert in his sunroom, looking at old newspapers with Sarah beside him. Mr. Williams started with a paper route too, just like me. He built something amazing from those humble beginnings. But more importantly, he and his family never forgot the value of helping others. The final slide showed both families together at Sunday dinner. Sarah, her mother, Robert, Margaret, and James. The photo captured a rare moment of clarity for Robert, his smile bright as he told stories about his early business days. Legacy isn't just about money or achievements, Sarah concluded. It's about the connections we make, the kindness we share, and the way we help each other find our way home when we're lost. My father left me that legacy of kindness. Mr. Williams built a legacy of giving back. And now, thanks to an unexpected meeting on a paper route, those legacies have combined into something even more meaningful. The classroom erupted in applause. Emma was crying openly now, and Jason Turner had completely forgotten about his phone. Ms. Parker stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Sarah, she said, her voice thick with emotion. That was extraordinary. After class, James hugged her tight. Your father would be so proud, he whispered. Robert was having a good morning, Margaret added. He wanted to come, but it's okay, Sarah assured her. We'll show him the video later. Her mother hadn't stopped smiling since the presentation. Baby, you showed them exactly who you are, not the scholarship student or the foundation kid, but your father's daughter. They had lunch together in Brighton's fancy cafeteria. Her mother, James, Margaret, and Emma, who'd been invited to join them. Other students stopped by their table, congratulating Sarah on her presentation. "You've changed the narrative," Emma said between bites of gourmet mac and cheese. "Everyone was so focused on the money part of your story. But after today, they see what really matters." Back at the Williams estate that afternoon, they found Robert in his study, looking through old photographs. "Sarah." His face lit up with recognition. "Did you finish your paper route?" "Not today. Mr. Williams the first gave a presentation at school about you, about how we met." "A presentation?" He looked confused for a moment, then brightened. "Ah yes, about finding home. Margaret, didn't Sarah help me find home once?" "She did, dear. She still does." They showed him the video of Sarah's presentation on a tablet. He watched intently, occasionally nodding or commenting. When it ended, his eyes were clearer than they'd been all week. "You started with papers too," he said, pointing at an old photo of himself. "Like me, building something bigger." "That's right, Mr. Williams, but not the money," he said firmly, surprising everyone with his clarity. "The helping, the seeing people who need help. That's the real building." James cleared his throat, obviously moved. "That's what you taught me, Dad. That's what Sarah's teaching all of us now." They had dinner together, as usual. Sarah noticed how the Williams chef had started including her mother's favorite foods in the rotation. How Margaret always made sure they had leftovers to take home. How James treated her mother as an equal partner in foundation decisions. Two families, brought together by chance and kindness, now permanently intertwined. Later that evening, as Thomas drove them home, Sarah's mother was unusually quiet. "Mom, are you okay?" "Just thinking about legacy," her mother said softly. "Your father's legacy of kindness. The Williams' legacy of giving back. How they've merged together in you." Sarah thought about her presentation, about Robert's moment of clarity, about the foundation's growing impact in their old neighborhood. "You know what Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday," her mother continued. "She said people in the neighborhood are proud of us, not because of the money or the new apartment, but because we're using our blessing to bless others." Sarah fingered her father's old watch. "Dad would like that. He'd love it, baby. And he'd love how you've handled everything. Staying humble, working hard at school, still visiting your paper route customers." They reached their apartment building, but neither made a move to get out of the car. "Mom." "Yes, baby. Do you think Mr. Williams will remember my presentation tomorrow?" Her mother squeezed her hand. "Maybe not the details, but he'll remember the feeling. Just like he always remembers you helped him find his way home." They finally went upstairs, where Sarah spread her homework across their new dining room table. As she worked on her calculus problems, she could hear her mother on the phone with James, discussing the foundation's expansion plans. Different kinds of paper routes, she thought, remembering Robert's words. Different ways of helping people find their way home. Different legacies merging into something new and beautiful. She touched her father's watch again, imagining him smiling down at her. The finest clothes in the world couldn't make a person fine. Only their actions could do that. In her Brighton uniform, living in their new apartment, surrounded by opportunities she'd never dreamed of, Sarah knew she was still the same person at heart. Her father's daughter. Her mother's child. The girl who couldn't walk past someone in need. Now she just had more ways to help, more paths to build, more homes to help others find. 3 months had passed since Sarah first helped Robert Williams find his way home. The autumn chill had given way to winter's bite, and Christmas decorations twinkled along the streets of their old neighborhood. Sarah pressed her face against the car window as Thomas drove them through familiar streets. "Look, Mom, Mrs. Henderson's house has a new roof." Her mother looked up from her foundation paperwork. First project completed. 17 more scheduled before the new year. They were heading to the Williams estate for a special dinner. 1 year ago today, Robert had gone for his fateful walk. 1 year ago today, Sarah had abandoned her paper route to help a lost stranger. 1 year ago today, two families' lives had changed forever. The Williams mansion looked magical, decorated for Christmas. Red roses still bloomed by the gate, protected from the cold in a newly built greenhouse, a gift from James to his mother. "Sarah." Robert's voice rang out clear and strong as they entered. He stood in the foyer, Margaret hovering nearby. "I remembered what day it is." Sarah hugged him carefully. His hugs had grown frailer over the past months, but his good days had become more frequent. "It's our anniversary," he said proudly. "The day you helped me find my way home." Margaret wiped her eyes. He's been talking about it all morning. One of his clearest days in weeks. James emerged from his study. Perfect timing. Dad, should we show them? Robert nodded eagerly. Yes, yes. The surprise. They followed him into the formal dining room. The long table had been set for a feast, but what caught Sarah's eye was the easel covered with a cloth. A little ceremony before dinner, James announced. He looked at Sarah. You changed our family's life that day. Changed this community. We wanted to mark the occasion properly. Robert gripped the cloth. May I? Of course, Dad. He pulled the cloth away, revealing a large framed photograph. Sarah gasped. It showed her in her old clothes, pulling her paper wagon, caught in profile against a sunset sky. Below it, a brass plate read, Sarah Johnson, Founders Scholar, Williams Foundation Youth Leadership Program. We're expanding the foundation, James explained, creating a program for young people who show extraordinary kindness and community spirit. You're our first scholarship recipient, but there will be many more. Each scholar, Margaret added, will receive the same opportunities you did, education, mentorship, and support to help others. Sarah's mother gripped her hand tight. Your father would be so proud, baby. There's more, Robert said, his voice trembling with excitement. He pointed to a stack of papers on the table. Show her, James. James picked up the papers. These are the incorporation documents for the Johnson Williams Community Foundation. Your mother will be full partner and co-chair, with equal stake in all decisions. Sarah's mother swayed slightly. What? We're merging our legacies officially, James said. Your understanding of community needs, your compassion, your vision, they've transformed what we do. This makes it permanent. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Robert said clearly. Like Sarah said yes when I needed help. Dinner was a celebration. The chef had outdone himself, preparing dishes that combined Williams' family recipes with comfort foods from Sarah's childhood. Emma and her parents joined them, along with Mrs. Henderson and several foundation board members. During dessert, Robert tapped his glass for attention. His hands shook, but his voice was strong. I want to tell a story, he began. About a paper route. The room fell silent. Even on his good days, Robert rarely spoke at length anymore. I was 12, like Sarah, delivering papers to help my family. One day, I saw someone who needed help. An old man, confused, lost. I stopped my route to help him. Margaret reached for his hand, tears streaming down her face. This was a story she'd never heard. He was a businessman, owned factories. When I got him home safe, he offered me a job. That job paid for my education. That education built. He gestured around him. All this. He turned to Sarah. I forgot that story. Lost it somewhere in my mind. But when you helped me, it came back. Life goes in circles. You see. Paper routes and kindness. Lost people finding home. Sarah couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. The money's nothing, Robert continued. Buildings, investments, nothing. But kindness? Kindness builds real things. Family, community, home. His eyes began to drift, the clarity fading. Margaret, what was I saying? You were telling us about kindness, dear, Margaret said softly. Yes, yes, kindness. The girl with the wagon showed kindness. James stood up. To kindness, to family, to finding our way home. Everyone raised their glasses. Sarah looked around the table. At her mother's proud smile, at Margaret's gentle care for Robert, at James's quiet strength, at Emma's friendly grin, at Mrs. Henderson's dignified presence. Different threads woven into a new kind of family. After dinner, they gathered in the family room. The Christmas tree sparkled, and outside, snow began to fall. Robert sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the snowflakes. Sarah, he called. Yes, Mr. Williams? Did you finish your paper route today? No, sir, I don't deliver papers anymore. Remember? He frowned. No papers? But how will people find their way home? Sarah took his hand. There are many ways to help people find home. Mr. Williams, you taught me that. Did I? He smiled. Good. That's good. He looked out at the falling snow. Margaret, is it time for my walk? Not today, dear. It's snowing. Snowing. He watched the white flakes swirl. Beautiful. Like the day I helped that old man. Or did someone help me? Sarah, did you help me once? Yes, sir, and you helped me right back. Later that night, back in their apartment, Sarah and her mother sat on their couch, looking at the framed photograph from the ceremony. Johnson Williams Foundation, her mother said softly. Your father's name living on, helping people. Just like he did, Sarah agreed. Just like Mr. Williams did. Just like we do now. Her mother pulled her close. Life's funny, isn't it? How one small choice can change everything. Sarah thought about that day 3 months ago. The lost man on the sidewalk. The abandoned paper route. The long walk home. She thought about Robert's story tonight. About his own paper route and act of kindness that built his future. Different kinds of paper routes. Different ways of finding home. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in white. In one neighborhood, Mrs. Henderson slept soundly under her new roof. In another, Margaret helped Robert prepare for bed, treasuring his moments of clarity. And here, in their warm apartment, Sarah and her mother held each other, surrounded by the legacy of kindness that had brought them all together. Sarah touched her father's old watch. Its steady ticking reminded her of paper wagon wheels on sidewalks, of time passing, of lives changing, of hearts finding their way home. Some people might call it luck or fate or coincidence. Meeting Robert Williams that day, having her life changed by a simple act of kindness. But Sarah knew better. She knew it was about choices. The choice to stop when others would walk by. The choice to help when it wasn't convenient. The choice to see people who needed to be seen. Her father had made those choices. Robert Williams had made those choices. Now Sarah and her mother were making them too, building something bigger than themselves, one act of kindness at a time. Different paper routes, different ways home, but always, always, the choice to help light the way for others.